Thank you for that introduction. So just to give a little background about myself, my name is Reme. I was born in Australia to Syrian parents, and when I was a child I moved to Syria, and that's where I grew up before I came back here to Australia. And some of my family members still live in Syria. I think to understand the Syrian conflict, or to know what's happening in that country right now, we must first know the background of Syria, or a bit of its history. And I believe that's important for us to identify the different sides in this conflict and to understand what the Syrian people have at stake. So when we talk about a movement in Syria which is supposedly meant to bring improvements to the lives of the Syrian people, the people advocating for this must first understand how the Syrian people were living before the conflict started. And I mean how they were really living, not how the news tells us they were living. Because if you want to help someone, you must first know where they're at, to make their lives better. Because what we don't want to do is to try to help a nation come forward, but instead push it back hundreds of years, unless, of course, that is what is intended in the first place. So the status of women in Syria never gets mentioned in the media. The issue of religious minorities has only just started to creep through, and particularly crimes against Christians. But as a Syrian woman, and having grown up there and gone to school there, I can tell you that Syrian women have full access to free education, and that is from kindergarten all the way through to university. To achieve a degree of equality in society, women need access to education, and Syrian women have that. Women in Syria occupy senior government positions, and during my visit recently in December last year, I was privileged enough to meet 3 of them. And Syrian women have won several rights which aren't available to other women in other Arab countries in the region. Sorry, I should have done this before. So unlike other Arab nations, Syrian women can pass on their citizenship rights to their children. They are given custody of their children, during marital disputes. Oh, yeah, full screen. Yep. And the Syrian constitution reads, "The state guarantees women all the opportunities that enable them to participate fully and effectively in political, social, cultural and economic life. The state works to remove the restrictions that prevent women's development and their participation in building socialist Arab society." So, even though there's always a long way to go, there's always more to gain. But I think what Syrian women have at the moment is an achievement, especially to countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia. And I do pick Saudi Arabia because it's an excellent example of abuses against women. And it is the main financer of the insurgency against the Syrian government, gunning for regime change. If we look at Saudi Arabia, women can't even drive in Saudi Arabia. They can't leave the house without a male. They can't speak in public. The first female law graduate from Saudi Arabia was in 2008, but women can't practice law in Saudi Arabia. Now 3 years have passed on the Syrian revolution, and Syrian women are in the worst position that they've ever been in history. While I was in Syria, I met a young Syrian woman called Rana. Rana works for a children's charity, and her fiancé, Samir, is a National Defence Force soldier. And she described how hard the last 3 years have been for her. and her family. But she says that she would never leave Syria. Because of time, I can't play this full video, but here's just a tiny bit of what we spoke about.
سامر بيشتغل شغل ممكن بأي لحظة أنا أخسره. إن شاء الله ما يصير هذا الكلام يعني. أنا ما عندي مشكلة لأنه هو قال لي مرة إنه إذا أنا ما عملت هيك أنا رح أخسركم. هو عم بدافع عن أمه وعن أخته وعني وعن أبوه وعن عائلته وعن رفقاته. هو عم بدافع عنا كلياتنا. فأنا فخورة بهذا الشيء. أنا ما بتمنى إنه هو يتركه يعني أنا بحترم هذا الشيء فيه مع إنه أنا بخاف طول الوقت عليه. وأنا بنفس الوقت كتير بحب البلد بحاول ساعد بطريقتي الشيء اللي بقدر عليه بالنشاطات اللي ممكن أكون فعالة فيها عن طريق شغلي ممكن كمان أقدر ساعد البلد مجرد إنه أنا أروح شغلي كل يوم وأرجع أنا بعتبره إنه ممارسة حياة طبيعية وهذا الشيء منيح ونحن نضل عم نمارس حياتنا الطبيعية وما نخاف وما نقعد ببيتنا. فبتخيل هي رح تجي تحب البلد أكتر مني ومنه لأنه رح نشربها هذا الشيء حتتشرب وأكيد حتكون مبسوطة إنه هيك اسمه حتكون فخورة إنه اسمها سوريا. ما بعرف رفقاتها بالمدرسة إيش حيقولوا لها لأنه ما له كتير اسم متداول بس أكيد حتكون مبسوطة وفخورة باسمه. أنا كتير بحبها لهي البلد يعني أنا عندي استعداد موت وما أطلع براتها. بفضل إنه أنا موت وما أتركها. كتير متعلقة فيها بشكل رهيب. الناس برا للأسف ما بتعرف قيمتها ما بتعرف. في ناس بتعرف في ناس لا إنه هي أقدم أرض بالتاريخ وحرام يصير هذا الشيء البشع بأقدم أرض بالتاريخ. المسج إنه يفتحوا عيونهم. أنا كنت كتير confused بهذا الوضع بعدين صارت الصورة واضحة. بتمنى يفكروا شوي يفتحوا عيونهم ويشوفوا الحقيقة مزبوط ومو يتعاطفوا مع الشعب السوري يحترموه لأنه عن جد يحترم. بس
So sorry about the bit about, I probably should have put that more into context. She was speaking about her future daughter and that she will name her Syria, and she explained why she will give that name to her daughter. So today, the Western world works with Saudi Arabia, one of the most anti-women and anti-democratic governments in the world, in an attempt to overthrow the Syrian government. US and Saudi-backed genocidal religious fanatics have committed mass murder of Christians, Alawites and Kurds. These imperialist-backed extremists would overthrow Syria's secular government to impose an Islamic state and anti-women Sharia law. When we take a look at Raqqa in northern Syria, Raqqa is the only province where the so-called rebels have managed to take full control and install a government of their own. On the 20th of January this year, ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, who are an Al-Qaeda offshoot, released a statement. This is an old church in Raqqa. They have taken down the crosses and turned it into their Sharia headquarters, and that's Al-Qaeda's flag right there. They released 4 statements. The first statement was about the imposition of the full face veil, requiring all sisters to wear the full face veil in public in line with Islamic morality. Women must wear Islamic dress, which consists of the full face veil and an abaya to cover the whole body in addition to gloves. Women are not allowed to raise their voices in the street or walk at a late hour without a male guardian. This sounds like a joke, but it's not. This is real. The other 3 statements were about banning cigarettes, music, and I think the opening of shops during prayer times. Every sister, this is the first one continuing, every sister that continues to violate Sharia after a 3-day warning will be punished along with her guardian. The statement asserted, stressing that if these rules are not applied, we risk losing control of the liberated areas. So now you know what it means when the rebels claim to have liberated an area in Syria. Also in Raqqa, a public strangulation of a young Syrian woman was carried out. It was filmed, and it was actually reported on by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, based in the UK. Her crime apparently was that she didn't adhere to the Sharia laws. So whether it was the dress code or drinking wine or using the internet, who knows? The Lebanese Daily Star and the British Daily Mail and a lot of other online blogs reported on a Syrian girl being stoned to death because she had a Facebook account, which is apparently the equivalent of adultery, according to ISIS. So she needed to be punished with the same punishment. This is Rudaina, another girl I met by coincidence in Syria. I learnt that, I met her in Damascus, but I learnt that she was originally from Aleppo. And she was forced to flee her home in Aleppo because foreign-backed militias came in, killed her uncle, and kidnapped members of her family. I won't be able to play the video of Rudaina because of the time, but what they were asking of her is for her to turn herself in to their Sharia courts. And the things she said to me was, they would ask around about me and came to my house 4 times. They objected to the fact that my fiancé was an Alawite. They'd say, you are now worse than a Jew, you Shia infidel. We will cut your head off and hang it in the center of Aleppo. We will send 10 men to rape you. Rudaina is now in hiding in Damascus, living away from her mother and her siblings. A women's rights advocacy group, which is based in Syria, called Nisa Suria, had this statement on their website. In the entire history of Syria, we have not witnessed the status of what the forces of this revolution have imposed. The destruction of women as human beings, to turn them into sex slaves in every sense of the word, ranging from the imposition of the veil, which is in itself violent and shameful to humanity, to the denial of education and employment, to making every detail of their lives being controlled by a man. It is no longer secret the women who have been gang raped by this revolution, before having their flesh torn off with knives, machetes, iron chains and crosses, because this woman had sinned, committed adultery, drank wine. And I'd like to point out that Nisa Suria is not a pro-government organisation. They are actually, they consider themselves to be in opposition to the government. So I just want to make that clear. So I would really love it if we could focus on these issues and focus on what is at stake for Syrian women and the Syrian people, and not sideline these legitimate incidents and fears just because of who you might think I support. Because you don't need to be an Assad supporter to realise that the immediate departure of his government, like is what being demanded by the armed opposition and their Western backers, will create a power vacuum, fragment the country, destroy what women have ever achieved, and reduce them to sex slaves and baby makers under the control of an extremist, fundamentalist, violent form of Sharia law. So the defence of the Syrian state today and what we have achieved previously is a matter of life or death for the rights of Syrian women. The Wahhabi, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are a clear indication of where we are heading if this so-called revolution is victorious. So I think when we hear about the Syrian conflict, we need to just stop and think about who we are supporting and what these people stand to lose as a consequence of our actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Reme. Our next speaker this evening is also